Welcome, busy gamers. Today we're going to be talking about Last Epoch. What's good, what's bad, and that all-important question, is it worth your time? If you've joined me for another worth your time video in the past, feel free to go ahead and skip straight to the section you want the most, and if not, we're going to be heading straight into the overview. Now, this particular game was developed and published by 11th Hour Games, and it's a hack-and-slash ARPG akin to Path of Exile and Diablo. It's still in early access after more than 2 years, but it does see regular and often sizable updates. In Last Epoch, you're going to be taking the role of one of 5 classes, each with 3 varied and different subclasses for a total of 15 unique ways to play. In your new role, you're going to be traveling through the world of Eterra, reaching the past, the present, and the future to face down darkness, wrathful gods, and even the wilds to save an entire timeline from the void. At the time of this review, I've probably played over 35-40 hours on this game. I've reached the end game with one character being the Sentinel or Void Knight, and I've also played around with a couple of the other classes. So let's move into the good here. What is good about Last Epoch? Well, the very first thing is character and build variety. It's one of the few games that I have felt extraordinarily good about creating a new character, not just to re-experience the story or re-experience the gameplay, which is a good gameplay loop here, but because they actually play very, very differently from each other. And that is not just the 5 core classes. The 5 core classes absolutely play different than each other, but even the subspecialties within the same classes, for example, the Sentinel, the Paladin versus the Void Knight, actually do play and feel very differently. In fact, because of the complexity of the skill trees within it, because of the fact that every single skill has a skill tree attached to it, you can make the same class feel relatively different as well. So even just within the Void Knight, so to speak. I found that to be excellent. I found that to stand out compared to a lot of games of this type, and that is something that I really wanted to hammer home here. Just because a game says it has 15 different classes does not mean that they will feel differently, but in this particular game, they do. The other thing I want to call out here is somewhat of a build forgiveness. I will say that in no means is this as forgiving as a game like Diablo when it comes to still being able to clear the content with any build. There's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more skill trees to pay attention to and maintain. That being said, you can reset quite easily without losing much whatsoever. You can change your specialized skills out without losing much, and that always felt like it kept me able to test without being punitive. Also, it doesn't get into the complexity as Path of Exile does. While it does have a lot of skill trees, they are a bit easier to understand, and I did not go out and find myself a build guide online for my first playthrough of this game, and I never felt like I was really struggling to complete any content. One of the other things I want to draw attention to here is the extremely varied world and the environment that the game is set in. It gets a benefit, of course, from its time-traveling theme. However, it makes a lot of use of these different locations when it time travels forward, when it time travels backwards, and it can create a stark difference in the look of feel of even the same place. So while variety is what I'm calling out here, I also want to note that in most areas, the scenery itself is also just quite striking. So not only does it have good variety, it actually has a good core look as well. They do a great job also at creating verticality in the scenery, as well as creating fun and interesting details below or behind the walkways. So if we're on a large spanning bridge, there's often going to be something interesting happening in the background and below you. The game's also very fast-paced, with skills, effects, and a ton of targets on the screen at once. This is a common problem for a lot of ARPGs, and that means that the telegraphing of an enemy's effect and the clarity of that effect is at a premium. You can't be expected to intuitively dodge something that you can't see, and I think Last Epoch does this better than most games of its type. Sure, in most cases it does boil down to red circles on the ground, but it's not as intrusive as in many games, while still remaining quite clear, and I think that is a feat and care that has been taken here. I've also already discussed the world environment a little bit, but on a related note, I think it's worth calling out the care that they took in the animations for different skills, as well as the way the animations are adjusted to the effects of the skills visually when they're modified through a skill tree or an item. So good animations, adjustments for skills when you take effects that might change them. And I want to give an example of that. So I said I played primarily a Sentinel, and I worked into Void Knight as my mastery. As I did, I took more and more adjustments to my core skills and rotations that added or adjusted my effects to Void. So this just changed the damage type. While a simple change, it did make me feel better because all of a sudden, black trailing tendrils came out of my sword as I swung it. It adjusted the colors and patterns of Smite and turned it black and dark and had an explosion come off of that. And I felt like it went a long way to making the new skills feel clear and impactful, and that my choices mattered. Travel in this game is also going to spoil you for other games, as very little will need to be done on foot the second time. Waypoint unlocks are very frequent, and the map does a good job at clearly marking both the era that you need to be in for a location's quest or a goal that you need to be completing. This means that you can either always port directly to where you want to go, or see via clear lines where the closest area you've unlocked is and the easiest path towards it. The final thing I want to talk here in the positives is, let's talk about the loot filter. It's detailed, it's expansive, and it's well thought out. I think it's a little bit difficult to set up if you're looking for something comprehensive, but the level of control it gives you over what you see is excellent. And because of this complexity, I probably recommend that you go and find something out online for this loot filter. There are things that you can do. So, the rest of this, I would say, is generically a good ARPG. If you are a fan of the format, this game has a lot of the positives that the overall format has, and very little of the negatives. That being said, there are bad things about Last Epoch, so let's move in and talk about what's bad. We just talked about the loot filter, and it is great if it's a bit fiddly. Unfortunately, the game just throws an extraordinary amount of trash and useless loot at you, which ultimately makes the need for the loot filter so high in the first place. Even after I got that extensive custom loot filter online that I was talking about, I found that I was constantly filling my inventory and I was needing to run back to town. Prior to having a loot filter, I could fill my inventory in minutes, and honestly, it just made me consistently less excited to see anything drop from an enemy, which in an ARPG that should never be the case, and you really shouldn't have to go through hoops to filter out that much trash. This is further expanded upon by placing all upgrade and crafting materials in your inventory, even though the game has a feature in which you click just one single button and you send it to storage where it can easily be used in upgrading your equipment. I never managed to understand why it wouldn't just automatically go to storage, where it wouldn't create clutter and an extra inventory management step. There are also bugs in this particular game, and more than I would like. Of course, it's still in early access, so I will give it a little leeway here. However, it's had an extremely long early access period, so I don't feel like we owe it a lot. While playing, I would occasionally notice that skills would get locked into a constant loop. This primarily happened on the Sentinel's Warpath or spinning skill, and sometimes this would be a visual-only effect, meaning I would see that I was still spinning, but it wouldn't do damage, it wouldn't drain my mana. Other times, there was a combination of the two. I would get a visual only effect, but it would drain my mana. And then the third option, of course, that I would get both the damaging effect and the mana drain when I wouldn't want it. This all could be broken by triggering other skills, but it did serve to really frustrate me during my time playing. There were also some skills and situations that themselves just felt clunky. They would cause your character to pause awkwardly, or shuffle oddly, or break what elsewise was a fairly fluid experience when moving and traveling and traversing the world. Then we'll move finally to the endgame. Now, I will admit that I haven't played a deep amount of the endgame. I only reached it and played a bit. But so far, for me, the endgame has felt shallow and looks to be consisting primarily of what seems to be just dungeons and the monolith of fate. Dungeons require keys that drop from enemies throughout your journey. Keys are then used to select a dungeon difficulty, and you've ramped up your difficulty as you progress. So each dungeon has a difficulty that you can progress through. The Monolith of Fate was pretty similar to the dungeon system in my mind, but it had affixes, so it altered the enemy type and area-wide affixes as you progressed through that world. Ultimately, none of this was bad, but it wasn't compelling enough to keep me focused on the endgame, and instead I quickly went back to experience other classes. So let's talk about the ephemeral efficiencies here. There are a couple things I think are good to talk about in this particular area. The skill and progression system is something we can dive in a bit more. Last Epoch tries to balance between games like Diablo and Path of Exile regarding its level of complexity and what it needs and demands of the player to have a decent build. In my opinion, they did end up much closer to Path of Exile here than the current builds we see in Diablo 4, but they are absolutely a middle ground. Each skill has its own skill tree, and the passive trees for your class and subclass are fairly expansive. Overall, they built a system that should appeal to the player that wants to build out a character on their own without looking up a build guide, but that has the potential to be min-maxed a lot and really focused on as well. The downside is that some of the core skills and passives do drastically change the way a skill works, and testing can be pretty time-consuming. In addition, while overall they're pretty forgiving in allowing you to respec and change your passives, once you've picked a mastery, you're stuck with that. So it is a completely new character to go from a paladin to a sentinel, etc. So that is a bit of a struggle for me. Now, while this is not an efficiency, I also feel like it's worth calling out the fact again that this game has taken a long time to update, and the story was not really well done for me. Now, we recently have seen a patch that really fixes the early story and makes that make sense. However, I found that to be something that I spent a lot of additional time on trying to kind of come to terms with what was going on. I haven't yet experienced their redo of that early story, and so that may make a huge difference, but it's something that I want to call out here. Let's go ahead and move on to the final scores. Overall, I'm going to be giving this game a 7. This is one of the best of its kind, and it sits between Diablo and Path of Exile in terms of complexity, but it always gives you plenty of impactful choices to sink your teeth into. It also boasts a variety of great locations, variety of skills, and solid graphics and animations. Unfortunately, as great as it is, both of the other games that I've talked about here probably exceed it in overall quality and longevity. As this game continues in development and it adds in additional systems and in-game activities, it will close the gap, but I don't know if it will ever take the top spot due to its short and slow development periods. Let's go ahead and move on to the ephemeral efficiency score here. I went ahead and gave this one a 7 as well. This is a double-edged sword here, as a lot of time needs to be spent maintaining different aspects of your build. That being said, you absolutely can hop into the game, play quickly, kill some enemies, make some progress without ever doing anything else. Even if I have 5 minutes and all I do is go out and kill 15 things. My character's made progression. I had the chance to drop items, I had the chance to gain experience, and things improved. And so that's actually really excellent. Also, like I said, the traveling is really good. So within 10 minutes, I've probably unlocked a new waypoint or a new area in the game. All of those things are really excellent, really friendly to the busy gamer. All right, that is my review of Last Epoch. I hope you enjoyed this content, and until next video, have a great time gaming.